So as somebody who is currently looking for a flat in Paris, I've really got close up and personal with the housing market here. And it's super competitive, super expensive, and options are really limited. So yeah, the housing crisis is definitely there for young people, but all people in general.
I mean, and imagine if you're looking to buy a house. And it's not just Paris, right? It's a Europe-wide issue. Although it is true that some cities are more impacted than others.
Absolutely. And I think buying a house is definitely a very remote dream for many of us right now. To give you a clear idea of what I mean, our guest today told me that for me to buy a house in Paris, it would take more than 23 years. Hi, I'm Renée Bertini.
And I'm Elena Pompei.
And this is Getting There, a podcast by ENTR in partnership with France 24 and RFI.
We're two Italian journalists. We live in France and we work in English. And we're part of the first generation who could see what a united Europe looks like.
We can move and work freely across Europe. We use one currency in almost every EU country, so we want to know what's next for the Union and how we're getting there. Young people really are one of the most vulnerable groups in this cost of living crisis. We're struggling to find jobs and pay for our basic needs. And, things like not having access to housing prevent us from making plans for the future.
And one of the things that makes me upset the most is having a Gen X or a boomer come up to me and be like, oh, but when I was your age, I had 3 kids and I just got a house. And I don't know, it makes me so upset because things aren't that way anymore for a reason.
Absolutely. And it's not because our generation is lazy or anything like that, which is something that often comes up in that kind of discourse. There's clear reasons why our generation struggles to pay rent, let alone buy a house. To discuss that, we talked to Aitor Hernandez Morales. He is senior reporter at Politico Europe, and he covers cities and is head of the Living City Global Policy Lab.
So in terms of the youth, what we have is a much more dramatic generational divide. So while being able to afford either rent or to buy a home was taken for granted, certainly by our parents' generation. For younger people, this is starting to become kind of the impossible dream. It's not the kids' fault. It's that we are all earning substantially less and housing prices have really increased.
Can I just say, it's so refreshing to hear someone say that it's not our fault or that of all the avocado toast we have on Saturday mornings.
I agree. We do not hear that very often. And Aitor actually had the numbers to back this up. He said that the price of rent has gone up by at least 20% on average across Europe. And if you want to buy a house, that's even worse. It's about 50% more to buy a house now than it was 10 to 15 years ago. And in some countries, that's even higher. For example, in Portugal and Germany, it's almost 100% more expensive to buy a house now.
It's crazy. But what does it mean in practice? I mean, say I'm a 27-year-old with a full-time contract. How long would it take me to earn enough to buy a house today?
That really depends on where you're looking to buy. Aitor pulled a bunch of data for me that Politico put together from Eurostat, Numbeo, and Investigate Europe.
If we were talking about buying a flat in most European capitals, we're talking about younger people that would have to wait decades to be able to pay off a 75 square meter apartment. So for example, in Prague, it would take an average of 25 years for someone to be able to pay off that property. Paris, 23 years. But even in what we would consider to be a relatively cheap city like Athens, we're talking about 12 years.
And to make things worse, Europeans have very little disposable income. And this is especially true of low-income households who end up spending almost 40% of what they earn on housing, which is massive. Mm-hmm. And to put this into perspective, about 20% of Europeans were considered as being at risk of poverty, according to the European Commission last year.
Yeah, that's not great news, or what I was hoping to hear. And it feels to me, and as you were just introducing this episode, that it's not just really hard to be able to afford a home, it's also very hard to find one.
Yeah, I definitely had the same question. And Aitor had a bunch of explanations for this, but the main one is actually pretty straightforward. We simply do not have enough houses, and we're not building new houses fast enough to accommodate our need. And Aitor had both political and historical explanations for this.
In the post-war period, what you see are very socially minded governments across Europe, whether they're left or right. Where that slows down is in the 1980s, when our economic models start changing, and you basically have governments across Europe come to the conclusion that the private sector can take care of this. We've done our job. And so they hand it over to the private real estate sector. And the result is that almost 40 years later, we see that the public real estate sector did not cover this issue and did not solve this problem. It stopped being a public policy issue.
I mean, I wouldn't want to simplify too much, but it feels to me like we're basically going back to a supply and demand issue. So is the answer to just simply build more houses?
I mean, kind of. It's not as simple as that, obviously. And we have to keep in mind that the households that are most affected are low income and middle class. So the kind of houses that we would have to prioritize building would probably be social housing. So, speaking about that, when we think about social housing, what kind of images come to mind for you, Elena?
I think the Corviale in Rome, Scampia, definitely, in Naples, just outside in the suburbs. But even in Paris, I mean, in the Picasso houses, for example, at La Défense, I don't know, I immediately think of these really big punch in the eye buildings.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's all buildings that have kind of been stigmatized, seen as ugly and degrading, or as Aitor would say,
that kind of housing is miserable for the people who live in it. It's an eyesore for those who don't, and nobody likes paying for it. Social housing, public housing, should be ideally for everyone. When we talk about its design, it should be at the standard that anyone would be happy to live there.
The city that is often taken as a poster child for the kind of social housing that Aitor is talking about is Vienna. But Vienna is a very specific example, and Aitor explained why.
The Viennese case is both everyone's dream, but also it's a very particular dream. We have to acknowledge that the reason why Vienna has a leg up over everyone is that after World War I, the city secretly bought up most of the land in the city, and they've never sold it off. And so they're in a really great position to build progressive social housing. And moreover, that social housing was designed to be of a standard where a middle-class family would want to live in it. And because it is very generous in terms of qualifications, middle-class families can qualify for it. So you have an intrinsic buy-in from society. Everyone is interested in having these good quality homes because they themselves have a realistic shot at living in them. That's a very different model from what most of us are used to seeing when we talk about social housing.
So Vienna definitely is not a model that can work for everyone because it's so specific, but it does underline the importance of the aesthetics of social housing and the fact that social housing needs to be something that cities are proud of and that they want to put forth, not something that is an emergency solution or that is an afterthought.
Definitely. And I think the aesthetics, element is very important, and at the same time is how functional these projects are. I mean, if you think about social housing, so many of those buildings were constructed having in thought kind of a city within a city. So places where people wouldn't really have to leave even or go back to the capital, because it's usually in the outskirts. And so this ends up kind of creating a class divide that's even bigger and isolating huge chunks of the population even more.
Absolutely, which is why social housing that encourages social mixing and gets rid of these lines that divide the population by class is super important.
Something that I'm wondering is, what are countries doing internally to solve this issue?
Left, right, center, all parties have gone through and no one has really done anything to tackle this problem. It's not an attractive topic for politicians, and that might be why they've neglected it so long, in that housing is expensive and it's slow. There are a lot of mayors that unless there's been a historic housing policy in their city, they won't touch it, because unless they're very, very secure in their position, more likely than not, whatever they build will only be finished when the next administration comes in.
Yeah. So unfortunately, this is one of these issues that, because of the time that it takes to tackle them, gets caught up in politics.
Yes, and people are starting to be really fed up with the situation. We've seen so many protests sparking in the past few years. For example, in Portugal, the Netherlands, Ireland, and even Italy, people are really starting to rise up against their own governments for the lack of leadership that they're showing.
People are tired. People are exhausted of working all day and then seeing that their money isn't enough to have something that they were promised was going to be a basic thing, that you would have a home of your own. And ultimately, housing, it's so intimate. It is your space. It is your sense of self in a lot of ways. And by not having that, and by having people feel that they have been cheated by the system, that's a dangerous situation to be in. And it's dangerous for politicians. So I expect that sooner or later they'll snap into action. But unfortunately, what we have seen with similar crises like, climate change is that politicians and governments will look for a million excuses before actually tackling the problem. And I expect that with housing, it will be relatively similar.
Yep. So as Aitor says, this really seems to be a recurring theme with anything that is, social justice policies or human rights or the environment.
For this entire episode, we've spoken about this huge crisis that is all over Europe. So something that I've been wondering is, why doesn't the EU and its leaders do something about it?
Yeah, I know, it really is not prioritized at all. And Aitor says this is partly because the EU does not have a clear mandate to intervene on housing. But if they did decide to step up and tackle this crisis, they could really have actually quite a big impact.
I think this is one of those where the EU should take charge and probably declare that this is a European issue that affects everyone, because it does. There's a lack of housing everywhere. Nobody's fine. No one can rest on their laurels and be like, we've got enough housing, we've got it covered, mission accomplished. So it really is one of those where, with the right sort of charismatic commissioner and with the promise of EU aid in this respect, possibly we could make some real progress. The only problem is, this is one of the issues affecting the European poly crisis. We have a war in Ukraine. We have the ongoing instability in the Middle East. We don't know what Russia's doing.
I see what he means. I mean, it looks like the EU's plate is kind of full already.
Exactly. But if EU institutions were able to kind of get together on this, they would be able to help with things like having housing ministers meet and coordinating national housing policies, which could be a good thing.
Thank you for being with us today, and we'll see you next week.
This episode of Getting There was hosted by Elena Pompei and Renée Bertini, produced by Elena Pompei and Renée Bertini, filmed by Guillaume Gugan and Jade Briangui. Thank you to RFI for technical support, and thank you to our guest, Aitor Hernandez Morales, for his time and expertise.